he says a couple of times, how do you get fear of God, love of God? By looking at his wonderful creation, looking at the wisdom in the creation, you can sense and you can appreciate God. Once you're corrupting that with all sorts of magical, mysterious forces, God's wisdom is really being lost on you.
Great. So, welcome to another episode of Open Book with Eitan and Itai. We have amazing guests, although Itai is not with us, so it's Open Book with Eitan this week. And Rabbi Shmuel Phillips, who's written an incredible, groundbreaking book called Judaism Reclaimed, which is doing very well in stores, in reviews, in critical circles, and it's generating a lot of buzz. So we're so honored to have you.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
It's a delight. It's a pleasure. I was just wondering, this is a monumental research project. I was wondering if you could describe to us a little bit about what made you decide to write this book. A little bit about the book, a little bit about the research process involved, and how it all came together.
So it wasn't just the product of sitting down one evening and sketching out a few ideas. It's really something which I've been working on for a long time. Ever since I sort of came to yeshiva and started really taking my Judaism more seriously, I was looking for an overall system to understand how Judaism works. I mean, I enjoyed studying the Gemara, studying the details within it, but I was always someone that looked to understand how the Jewish legal system worked, how the philosophical system, the theological system of Judaism worked. As I did a law degree in England, and I appreciated how the secular law system all fitted together. That made me look even more to see, well, how can we relate to that to the Jewish law system?
Right.
So that led me very much to the Rambam, who's the great codifier, the great systemizer. He sets out how all of these things fit together, and gradually sketching out my ideas, going through this more, getting into discussions with people who were, as we call them, not quite the nevuchim, not quite the perplexed, but yeah, people who are on a journey and not understanding how things in Judaism work. I found that many of the things that I've been putting together, both from Rambam and also Rav Shimshon Hirsch, who's the other rabbi I really draw a lot on in Judaism Reclaimed. So I found that many of the ideas I was able to extract and put together were able to help them a lot. And this turned into sort of a weekly email, WhatsApp I was sending around to the parasha,
Right.
and that grew eventually far more research into Judaism Reclaimed.
So with Mosaica, was this kind of a push from Rabbi Haber, or how did they get on board?
So in terms of Mosaica, I was really looking for a publishing house that wasn't, far to the right as an art scroll type, or further to the left as in Koren, who only cater to pretty much to one specific market, whether it's the very modern Orthodox or the Haredi world. I saw my book as being able to help, able to appeal to people across the spectrum. And I really had that. I've had people who aren't Orthodox at all, who really have been inspired by some of the things I've written, who have been surprised that this is so much systematic thoughts and how the Jewish halachic system works, and they've really gained a lot from it. And I've had someone who I spoke to Yeshivat Hebron today, who read my book, who came over to discuss it with me, who'd been helping him a lot. I know it's being read in Gateshead Yeshiva. So I was really looking for a publishing house that wouldn't pigeonhole my book, so to speak.
Wow.
And someone like Mosaica, relatively to the middle of the road, I could get my book into both of the more Haredi stores in America through Feldheim, and also appeal to people to the left of that. And thank God it's been successful in that.
Wonderful. Why did you name it? I think this is a good question also to kick off with. Why did you name it Judaism Reclaimed? How did you come up with that name?
So it's reclaimed in two aspects, really. One, that it endorses, it furthers, it tries to probe very much the more rational side of Judaism, which in many areas is, whether it's been forgotten totally, it's not seen as the normative position.
Well, what's the normative position these days?
Well, with the growth of popularity of Kabbalah and mysticism, They're very much, if we look at things like how hashgacha works, providence, or the way people look at magic, various different things in the Torah, people take on the mystical approach to things as normative. And when you mention the Rambam's approach, they're very often surprised that someone as great as the Rambam, and Rambam isn't just the Rambam, he's continuing a whole Gaonic tradition and the Andalusian tradition in Spain. They're very surprised that such a rationalist position is, or at least was, mainstream within Judaism. So to an extent, I'm trying to reclaim that sort of more philosophical, rational way of looking at things. And also, in terms of some of the chapters of the book, they're responding to many of the academic challenges to Judaism. Put forward by whether it's biblical critics or non-Orthodox challenges to Orthodox Judaism. And I try to reclaim Judaism sometimes from some of these challenges and show how Jewish tradition, whether it's Rav Hirsch or the Rambam, try to identify various techniques and various ideas that they use which can reclaim Judaism from some of the challenges which are presented from these quarters.
Is the mystic approach a valid approach, in your opinion?
So, I'm not sure it's my place to say what is a valid or non-valid approach. I see that within Judaism we definitely have both elements. We have the rationalist elements, and we have sources which point towards mysticism, and it's really a question of how to put them together. There are people who frame rationalism and mysticism as two irreconcilable perspectives in Judaism, and you got the Rambam on the one side, you've got mystics on the other side, and you just got to pick your camp and fight your corner. I try in the introduction to Judaism Reclaimed to show, at least to an extent, how we must be able to work with both. And yes, for the Rambam and for Rav Hirsch, the emphasis is on approaching God and understanding things in a more philosophical manner, but one cannot negate and ignore the mystical, the experiential, the spiritual side completely. I use an example of, it's based on a Midrash Rabbah, the way it's explained by the Cheret Mordechai of Rav Mordechai Shvadron, of the dove with two wings, and how the Jewish nation is compared in the Midrash to a dove with two wings.
Right.
So that if one wing gets tired, the dove can still fly with the other wing. And one wing is identified as the more rationalist, philosophical approach, understanding Judaism, trying to investigate everything. And the other wing is the more experiential, spiritual side. And I think very much that before one sets off on this rational project, on this philosophical project to try and understand all the depths of Judaism, one first has to have this very firm basis, this relationship with God, this being able to relate to and experience something much greater than oneself. And on the basis of that, one can then go ahead and start speculating, analysing, however you want to put it, the more profound aspects of Jewish tradition.
So the book encompasses such a wide range of topics and issues, and both of us thought it best to focus on a specific topic, at least for this show, which is something I found kind of a reoccurring theme, possibly, whether intentional or unintentional, of like Nevuchim and Apikorsim, heretics and skeptics, or the reverse, skeptics and heretics.
Right.
So we'll ascend into a discussion of both. Let's go into skepticism. Let's say there's a hypothetical person who has trouble with one of the 13 principles of faith laid out by the Rambam. Do you think that would make them a heretic?
So it's quite a difficult question between what one calls accepting, what one calls denying, what one calls skeptical. What does it mean by belief? Does it mean you have to understand everything about it in order to deny or accept? So, I mean, if we take the Rambam straight up, he says that before one even starts investigating the more difficult, the elements of Jewish belief, one must first accept Judaism as a tradition. He says in the first section of Moreh Nevuchim, I think it's chapter 34, he goes through all the difficulties that people have with pursuing and probing Jewish thought. And he says that, well, if we didn't have the tradition from Sinai, if we didn't have the tradition from our ancestors, we could go through the whole of our life just investigating, does God exist or not, and never come up with a satisfying answer.
So we have to start somewhere.
So the Rambam says you have to first start off by accepting the tradition, accepting the principles of faith that we've been taught, and once one has that, then the next stage is to go on and probe things and to try and understand everything. So the first question is just sort of stating some sort of acceptance of the, I guess we call it the creed, accepting the 13 ikarim, the 13 principles of faith, and accepting or denying it. And then there's a question of, once one starts investigating them on a more profound level, does one agree, does one have certain levels of doubts? And the question is, what are the implications for believing or not believing? You can really split it up into two questions. One is the practical halachic question of being called a heretic, apikoros.
Right.
It has various implications for example, can one be counted towards a minyan?
Right.
Is a sefer Torah that one writes valid? Is one's shechita, one's ritual slaughter, valid? So that's really a practical halachic question for a Beit Din to rule on. And again, a Beit Din cannot go into the precise extent to which one believes or is skeptical and compare different beliefs in that. So for that, I think very much it's someone who stands up and says, I do not believe in Torah min hashamayim, Torah from heaven, or I do not believe Tchiyat HaMeitim or the coming of Mashiach. Someone who actually stands up and positively rejects one of the 13, that sort of person we can say can be ruled halachically as a heretic, and we can invalidate their slaughter or not account them for a minyan. So levels of skepticism I just don't think we can get into practically. But then there's a second question, which the Rambam gets into very much, in terms of the 13 ikarim, the 13 principles of faith, being a litmus test, so to speak, the entry criteria for Olam Haba, entry criteria to see if you can get into the world to come. And that is much more difficult, because it's not the Beit Din, it's not humans judging this is God judging it.
Right.
So to what extent does one, if one has doubts about certain aspects of Torah min hashamayim, one accepts or believes certain aspects of it, not others, will one get into Olam Haba? That's really going to be a question for God to rule on.
Right.
and that's not something which we can certainly say, for example, that if one denies outright Torah min hashamayim, if one denies certain core aspects of the oral tradition, that will set one outside the camp, and we can invalidate the slaughter, not get them to a minyan. So if one is skeptical about certain aspects of it, that is not something which I think we can rule on as part of our halachic system and invalidate people today.
Right.
That is something which will be, I guess, ruled on by God in terms of whether the person gets into the world to come.
Right. We had an author recently on the show. After the show, I didn't get to ask him on the show. I said, you mentioned in your book God being shocked or surprised at the actions of humans. How can, well, you talk also in your book about metaphor and literary, but that's in the Tanakh text. I asked him, how can God be shocked? Isn't he omniscient? And he said something that very surprised me. He said, where does it say that? I was like, what do you mean? I think it's part of the 13 Ikarim. Like, I'm not so baki, but, and he's like, well, not everyone accepts the 13 Ikarim. And I was thinking that's news to me. I said, well, he's God, he's omniscient. And he said, how do you know? So that kind of stumped me. So I asked, someone who's more learned than me, Rabbi, how do we know? How do we know that God is omniscient?
How do we know?
I know I'm asking the big questions here, but like, practically, I mean, if there's a God that created the world, then therefore he would know everything. it's a deeper question than.
So we do have to accept that God is perfect. God is unlimited. That is, he's all powerful. He's not limited or subject to.
Before we accept the 13 Ikarim, we have to accept that Hashem is infinite, limitless, not bound by time. That's just to step into the religion at all.
Well, if we have to relate to a god, a monotheistic god, we know the God of the Torah is a monotheistic God. Right. That means that, well, if you're going to say he's limited, what is he limited by? There must be another force out there which you are saying or implying is greater or able to influence him. And that gets you into paganism. The thin line between monotheism and paganism is whether God is limitless and God is all-powerful. You could say all-knowing as part of that. We can get into that afterwards. Whether God is all-powerful and all of the physical world, everything else is subject to him. Or whether we say that no, there are many different forces, divine forces, and there are different powers out there that can influence God also, and God is therefore limited by them. And that is a dividing line between monotheism and paganism, and we find this related by a Midrash. We have the debate between Avram Avinu and Nimrod, and we have many interesting ideas put into these debates, but one of them really defines and highlights the difference between monotheism of Avram and the paganism of Nimrod. And we find Nimrod saying to Avram, bow down to the fire. And Avram says, well, I can't bow down to the fire. That can't be God because the water can put out the fire. Or bow down to the water. No, well, water can be blown away by the wind. So bow down to the wind. And this goes on and on. And the idea is that Avram, this is this idea of a Midrash and what it can show you, whether they had this conversation or not, what we're being shown is that Avram is not prepared to deify anything which is not all-powerful. Monotheism means there's one ultimate power which is unlimited. And Nimrod is saying, well, bow down to all the different powers. There's the god of fire, there's the god of wind, there's the god of water, and we can bow down to all of them. They all somehow have divine forces. And Avram is saying, no, the God that we believe in, monotheism, is not affected by anything.
Something that I found kind of apologetic almost is the Rambam engaging in apologetics is when he sort of mocks the idea of believing in the existence of demons or magic or sorcery. So from my point of view, which is pretty unlearned probably, I would say that's kind of not naive, but I would say that there's pretty clear evidence for the Egyptians using magic, for there being demons, for all kinds of things like that. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? Is magic real?
Well, you mentioned the Rambam, and the reason the Rambam opposes it and takes such a strong line of it, you see, where did he talk about magic and necromancy, divination? Well, more than that, in his legal codes, it's a chapter in Hilchot Avodah Zarah. It is. Right, yeah, he discusses it in the laws of Avodah Zarah. For Rambam, believing that magic is real, there's a genuine dark side out there. There are forces which can counter and eclipse God's natural world. Is whether it is idolatry, it's definitely related to idolatry. He talks about
it's
how
sword. There's no question that it's a sword. If magic exists, or if divination exists, or all the fortune tellings that we're forbidden from doing by the Torah, they're a sword. We're not supposed to do. From my understanding, we're not supposed to do astrology. All of that. The question is it real? And he says no.
He says more than no. He says that believing in, first of all, he says in the Mishnah Torah that believing in it is just a matter of fools. It's all trickery.
Right, exactly.
But how did it come about? Who are the sort of people? And Rav Hirsch talks about this also. Who are the sorts of people who were doing all this magic, and why? It was the pagan priests who were trying to convince people that there was something real and mysterious and some sort of real power in their idols, and they would come up with all these sorts. And I think if you look in the academic sources, also you find how they did all these sorts of tricks within their temples to try and persuade people that there was something real to their idols.
In Africa, a lot in India. the question
So really, what we're just carry on one moment. So what they're really trying to claim is that there are sources of power independent of God. For Rambam, the laws of nature were set up by God during the days of creation.
right.
Everything that we have that runs the natural world is based on God's wisdom, and we can relate to him, we can appreciate, and we can, to an extent, understand God through his natural world. It's an amazing, wondrous world. The rock, his handiwork is perfect. And if you come along now with your magical forces, and there are alternative sources of power that can somehow overcome the natural world, whether or not you relate that to the idols, you're setting up a rival set of power to God, and that is automatically associated with Avodah Zarah.
So I find this interesting because I'm not sure if you're familiar with Rabbi Pinchas Taylor. He also wrote some books for Mosaica, and in his book, A Jewish Guide to the Mysterious, he points out that it's more than a coincidence that every culture ever has had some belief in magic. How did that happen? Because this is something that isn't natural. I see it as Hashem put also magic into the world, just like he put gravity, just like he put the rules of magnetism. There's just...
So the fact that every culture has some kind of way of relating to magic, I mean, the way the Rambam looks at it is that the Torah comes along. What was the Torah? What is the Torah? It comes along to withdraw the Jewish people from the pagan world. The whole world, pretty much, aside from a few individuals like Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the whole world was pagan. The whole world was doing these weird mystical rites, believed in multiple gods, believed in magical forces, and the Torah came along to cure us from that, and to draw us away from magical, mysterious, idolatrous ways of looking at the world, to train us, to refine us, to relate to the God of monotheism, the God of the Torah. So human nature, left, if you look at something like Lord of the Flies, human nature left to its own devices will tear itself apart.
Yeah.
It'll believe in all these demonic forces. It'll see. I mean, we look at the world, and this is what the pagans did. You look around the world, you see all these different physical forces, and you assume this reflects different divine forces up above. And when the one physical object overcomes another physical object, it's because one god has battled another god, and you have to sacrifice things to this god and that god, and they're all fighting each other. That is the humanity left to its own devices, unless you have some exceptional individual like Avram who can see through it all. But human nature will descend to the depths of looking at everything in a magical, mysterious way. So according to the Rambam, it's a long journey to draw the Jewish people, who again they'd been in the pagan society and the beliefs of Egypt, to draw them away from these magical, mysterious, idolatrous beliefs, which are human nature.
So I'm wondering, I have two questions and then we'll go to a break. My first question is like this. So is the point that you're making now kind of that, or maybe that the Rambam was making, is that the magic and the things are like that are unethical because they're untrue, and that's what makes them, that's why the Torah prohibits them, because it's foolishness? And my second question is kind of diverges, and I wanted to ask you about Ayin Hara. Is Ayin Hara a real force in the world? So you can however you want to combine the answers.
So deal with them one at a time. So Rambam is telling us that the magical forces, first of all, it's foolishness, because we can relate to and appreciate God by seeing how he's built the world. He says a couple of times, how do you get fear of God, love of God? By looking at his wonderful creation, looking at the wisdom in the creation, you can sense and you can appreciate God. Once you're corrupting that with all sorts of magical, mysterious forces, God's wisdom is really being lost on you. But it's more than that. It's belief in magic and these rival dark forces that are somehow running the world and eclipsing God's creation, according to the Rambam, steers you away from the single God running the world towards these different sort of dark, mystical, almost pagan forces, which are some sort of counter force to God.
Right.
The second point about Ayin Hara, it could be, if you go back to the sources of some of the statements that people quote about Ayin Hara, you can relate them more to Hashgacha and divine providence. For example, I heard this idea from Rav Aubrey Hirsch in London. If we find there's a pasuk in Mishpatim, it talks about how do not oppress the orphans, the widows, and everything like that. Because if they cry out to me, if you oppress the orphans and they cry out to me, I will listen to them and I will, can't remember exactly how it is, I'll destroy you, I'll wipe you out, whatever it is. So the idea is, if you take what God has given you, you take the bounty, the blessings that God has given you, and this is the context of the psukim there, you take what God has given you and you flaunt it and you make people feel bad about the blessings you've been given instead of using it to help people, then God providentially will react to you in a very negative way. So that's something which is basically there in the psukim, and there are Gemaras there which talk about it also. Yosef was someone who was not subject to Ayin Hara. He had great wealth, but he used what he had to feed the whole world. So again, if you've been given possessions, if you've been given wealth, if you've been given blessings by God, use it to benefit other people. That's great. Use it to flaunt in people's faces and make people feel that they've missed out and that they're lacking and they are upset and they cry out to God. God will react to that and withdraw those blessings from you. So that aspect of Ayin Hara we can understand, we can rationalize, if you want to put it that way. The whole Ayin Hara of wearing red, the right color strings and chanting various things at certain times and not doing certain things with Ayin Hara, that starts swinging more towards the sort of mysterious pagan. If I say this, then I'll cause a certain force to hit me and to hit someone else. Certainly, don't flaunt things.
That sounds problematic. Yeah.
Right. Don't flaunt things. Don't put your wealth out there openly. People to get jealous. That Ayin Hara, that makes people feel bad. Right. Don't say certain things at certain times. Make sure you're wearing the right color clothes to counter the Ayin Hara. That's getting into problematic areas, certainly.
Right. The reason I ask the question is because I get a lot of flack from people because I tend not to be very expressive on social media. I try to be tznuah with accomplishment. When I was making Aliyah, I didn't tell anyone. Because I feel like if things don't work out, one, you look silly. Second of all, if why should you be so excited about an accomplishment in everyone's face? Maybe someone else can't have a baby. Maybe someone else can't get married. And whether or not Ayin Hara is a real thing, you're hurting them. But even besides that, they say, even the Goyim believe in it because they say pride cometh before the fall. Where did they get that from? So I see certain forces in the world as existent and built into the fabric of nature. So I find it a little odd for the Rambam to call those forces, belief in those forces, foolish.
So for the Rambam, any belief which attributes power and reality to something which is not part of God's actual creation, but some sort of mysterious, unexplained force, if it's not Hashem's direct hashgacha, Hashem's direct providence, that's a problem. We can say, yes, that God works within the world in a providential way. We pray to God, and God reacts in a certain way. However exactly we explain that either, but we can understand that God works providentially. We believe that God is all powerful. Once we start saying that there are certain angels or certain forces or certain wearing certain things which influences all of that, and there are alternative power sources which I can be doing something, but I step on the wrong ladder or the black cat or whatever it is.
Don't walk in the way of the Edomite or something like that. And I don't recall.
Darkei Omari, which is you're right. Don't go in the ways of the Amorites. That is precisely that. The way the Rambam explains it in Moreh Nevuchim, that any belief which is irrational, putting a certain pin in a wall, or a fox's tooth, whatever it is, in a certain way, if it's
superstitions,
if it's a superstition which doesn't have any basis in logic, you can't. It doesn't seem to arise from anything which we can explain. So we call it scientifically.
What about in halacha, putting one shoe, then the next shoe, or one sock and then the next sock? What about all of that?
So many of these halachot, some of them do come from some kind of superstition. I don't know if Rambam would go along with all of them, but many of them are there to teach certain ideas. For example, right and left and how you tie things relate to the tefillin. They attribute certain chashivut, certain importance to where the tefillin are, and they come to remind you of certain ideas. So, washing your hands in the morning. So for the Rambam, that is why do you wash our hands in the morning? It's not to wash some sort of impure spirit off us. It's because, the Rambam actually talks about washing hands and feet, I believe, because like the priests, like the Kohanim, when they go to serve God in the Midrash, they would wash their hands and feet first. Our day is starting off. We are, so to speak, also cleansing ourselves to serve God. So it's symbolic. It's there to remind us and put certain thoughts and priorities symbolically into our minds.
Wow. So we're going to pick up and move from more of a discussion about skeptics into a discussion about heresy, what constitutes heresy. But first, I just want to tell our listeners about Pomerantz Bookseller. Michael Pomerantz has been selling books in Jerusalem now for over 30 years. And during that time, he's learned that the most important thing is his customers. That is why if you come into Pomerantz and there's a book you want, even if they don't have it, they're going to do their very best to get it in for you. They have all kinds of books. As you guys know, we have Judaism Reclaimed by Rabbi Shmuli Phillips. Besides that, there's all kinds of books. There's more books on the Rambam. There's cookbooks. There's children's books. And right now they have an amazing selection of Haggadahs. Whatever you need, they can get it in for you, no problem. Reach out to them. Their phone number is 02-623-5559, 02-623-5559. You can email them also. You can WhatsApp them. And listeners of the show can get a 10% off on most books in the store. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So in chapters 9 and 10 of your book, you criticize Mark Shapiro's premise that because of diverging viewpoints in Judaism, you can't really assign any certain viewpoint as heretical. So what do you think makes a belief heretical?
So if we're working on the basis, which I do, of the Rambam and the 13 principles of faith, so we discussed in the first half, completely denying any of these 13 principles certainly would make one heretical. There's the further question, as Mark Shapiro did point out, there are certain levels of dispute within where to draw the boundary on many of these questions. For example, on the question of Torah min hashamayim, believing that the Torah is from heaven, so on a very basic level, is every word of the Torah, every pasuk, every passage came directly, to God, from God to Moshe. Nothing has changed. Nothing could be changed. Then you find that our authorities, whether it's the Ibn Ezra, whether it's other people, who will say that certain things could be added later. And we start off with one of the opinions in the Mishnah that the last 8, or Ibn Ezra puts up to 12 pasukim were written by Yeshua after Moshe had died. And then you find Ibn Ezra and other people who seem to indicate, well, perhaps whether edits or there are other prophets that added or changed things afterwards. So exactly where do you draw the line in terms of the details? That's a good question. But what I argue in Judaism Reclaimed is that heresy is something which is part of the halachic system. It's something which invalidates people's slaughter. It can invalidate the writing of the Sefer Torah. It is a halachic category. And anything halachic, as the way the Rambam describes it, has the core aspects, and then it's got details which can be thrashed out and can be devolved to the sages to determine. So I'd say that anyone who denies certainly the core aspect of any of the 13 principles of faith is certainly a heretic. Where you draw the line,
question.
Right? Where you draw the line between certain beliefs, and if you want to say that, let's say, a little edit done by a prophet later of the Torah, or which aspects of, for example, the oral tradition. So the Rambam will tell you that every mitzvah of the Torah was handed over with Torah Shabal Peh, the oral tradition, the Perush Mekubal, there was a received explanation for each mitzvah. Each one of the commandments, it has the basic elements of it explained in the oral tradition.
Explanation on
for
the
example,
performance of the mitzvah, or on the
certain
reason?
not necessarily reasons, but core details. For example, that the pre-8 Hadara that we take on Sukkot is an etrog.
Yeah.
And ayin tachat ayin.
No Jew disputes that.
Right, that can't be disputed, and disputing the oral tradition on that. Again, it's written in the Torah. It could be any pretty fruit you take along, it's fine. Or ayin tachat ayin. Eye for an eye is to be rendered as a monetary penalty, not a physical. Literally, it's a physical, but the oral tradition tells us, and what Rambam tells us, is from Sinai. This is received from Moshe, and these pirushim bikubalim, these central explanations of the text and these central aspects of each mitzvah, they are also part of the Torah, which we received and cannot be disputed. But in terms of the finer details, where you draw the line between that and other elements, if you say that there was a later edit by a prophet, or whether you say exactly where you draw the line between what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable, that I'm not sure we necessarily know when something is certainly heretical. The core aspect of every one of the 13 principles, if one believes that there's no such thing as the Mashiach, or no such thing as resurrection of the dead, or that one can or one can pray to something that isn't God, setting aside the question of angels, which again may be the according to some that may be a grey area which we cannot necessarily define, but going and praying at a grave to a grave of someone, or going and praying to a tree. These are things which are certainly out of the question.
For sure.
Certain grey areas we may not be able to declare someone a heretic, and that's Mark Shapiro has showed that there are disputes around the edges. But certainly the central aspects of each ikar, of each principle of faith, rejecting that would make one a heretic, certainly.
So if someone questions the authenticity of the oral tradition, if someone says an eye for an eye means literally if I took out his eye, my eye needs to be taken out, that's a heretic? That's heretical belief?
Right. If one knows that, or is told that the tradition from Moshe was clearly and indisputably eye for an eye is rendered in a monetary fashion, and as Rambam writes, no Jewish court has ever taken out a physical eye as a response to an eye being taken out, and one rejects that. That is a rejection of the principle, the ikar of Torah min hashamayim, right?
So what if someone holds, let's say the majority of the Jewish people hold one way in terms of a dispute in the Gemara, and someone decides they're going to hold the other way, the opinion that we don't hold, or someone decides that there is some kind of error in the Talmud. Every word of the Torah was from Shammai, but the Talmud went through censorships, edits, stuff like that. Is there a problem there?
It may be wrong. I'm not sure it'd get you into a discussion of heresy.
Right.
If one is denying a central core aspect of the oral tradition, then one discusses heresy. If one is ruling like a minority opinion of the Talmud, or not determining halacha in the right way, it can certainly be said that one has gone wrong in a certain aspect. One can be criticised for it, but that definitely that's in the category of heresy, certainly.
So a little after my bar mitzvah, I heard the Midrash about the sun and the moon. Why is the moon smaller than the sun? And it was one of the things that made me kind of, for a few years, take a step back from religion. Be very skeptical. And then later I found that there are opinions that these are allegorical. So if you question the veracity of a Midrash, if you say, I don't think that happened, that's meaning that's true but not a fact. It didn't happen, but there's intrinsic truth. Is that a problem?
So, first side, is it a problem? Someone like the Rambam will tell you that is how you have to read them.
Exactly.
If you accept it literally, then you are foolish. You're turning the sages into idiots. He says that people will think that they're doing the sages credit by holding on to the literal rendering of every word of the Midrash and every word of the Agadah. Well, they're making them look like fools, like idiots.
Wow.
And we have to understand what the Agadah is. It's certainly, I mean, in Judaism Reclaimed, they go through how there are basically 4 different categories of Agadah. There are some traditions which are really sort of historical traditions that we've received. We have a tradition X, Y, Z, but most of it, they are ethical lessons. They're being put into Agadic form because that makes us easier to relate to. It's how teachers and the Agadists were religious teachers, and they taught things in a certain way by putting them into an Agadic setting. And then the very profound ones, as to quote a Midrash, I think it's the Sifri tells us, if you want to understand the one who created the world, go and learn Agada, go and learn Midrash. And the Rambam explains that there are certain very profound truths that we can't just write out for everyone, and they're hidden within the Midrash.
We want to, Mamash, thank you for coming on. It's been so special.
Thank you. It's an honor to have been on your show.
Oh. And for our listeners, if you don't have a copy of Judaism Reclaimed, you shouldn't wait. You should call Pomerantz Bookseller now. 02-623-5559. I'll give you guys 3 weeks after this show ends to get up to 15% off on this book. It's an extremely special price for an extremely special book. I loved it. I'm going to reread it, in fact. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.